Mental disorders are a very common problem in our society and our world. Recent research indicates that 1 in 5 people at some point in their lives will experience a mental disorder. So this is very widespread. It's something that touches and affects all of us. And yet we might not have a really great understanding of what causes mental disorders and how they come about. So in this lesson, I'm going to unpack some of the factors that may contribute to the onset of a mental disorder or help protect someone from the onset of a mental disorder. This doesn't mean there's one answer, one cause, this is why mental disorders happen, but it's a few contributing factors. So to help us understand what causes mental disorders or what can contribute to the onset, there's 4 P's. So it's nice and easy to remember. There are 4 P words that can help us understand. So the first one is predisposing factors. To be predisposed to something means that you've got sort of a leaning towards something. I'm predisposed to enjoy rock music because it's what I grew up with, so I'm more likely to enjoy it. I've got a leaning towards it. So predisposing factors, I'm going to indicate with an X way back here. They are things that are pre-existing and long-term. They're possibly existing throughout our whole lives or several years that can contribute to the onset of a mental disorder in an individual. So pre-existing and long-term, they're way back in our history. They don't necessarily cause the onset of a mental illness. They're not causal. I shouldn't say not necessarily. They are not causal. They don't directly cause a mental disorder, but they do make the person more susceptible or more vulnerable. They've got that leaning towards being able to develop a mental disorder. So it's things like a family history of a particular mental disorder, like my father and my grandfather had depression. That might mean that I'm predisposed to developing depression as well. It could be personality traits, again, long-term things like having low self-esteem throughout across many years. It might not necessarily be from birth. I'm not sure if babies can have low self-esteem, but say in your teen years you develop low self-esteem and that persists through decades into adulthood. That would be a predisposing factor that might make an individual more likely to develop a mental disorder later in life. Poor physical health, anything that sort of long-term, ongoing, has existed through a decent portion of an individual's life can then be a predisposing factor. That can then be distinguished with precipitating factors. These are, I'll indicate with a much closer X here, these are more immediate. These are things that don't just increase your susceptibility, but contribute directly to the onset of a mental disorder. So it can be things like a major stressor, so experiencing something really intense and painful, the loss of a significant relationship, being fired from someone's job, right? These things are major stressors, and these could have sort of a direct, immediate impact on the onset of a mental disorder. It can include things like drug use and all kinds of things that are happening right now that can contribute. Now, I should point out here, I'll add the word contributes, right? It directly contributes to the onset. I should point out at this point that everyone's different, right? So if you're looking at this saying, oh, I've got some predisposing factors, I've got some precipitating factors, that doesn't mean you're going to develop a mental disorder. Everyone's different. Everyone experiences and interprets things differently. And we'll talk in the last P there, the protective factors, about some of the reasons why one individual may develop a mental disorder while another doesn't. However, I will point out here that these two things together, I'll just try and get a different color. These two things together can be described or summed up with this idea of the 2-hit hypothesis, which you may have heard of before. Sorry, squeezing it in there. The 2-hit hypothesis. This is the idea that predisposing factors alone aren't enough to explain why someone might develop a mental disorder, and precipitating factors alone aren't enough to explain why someone develops a mental disorder. But it's when you get both hits, right? 2 strikes. When you've already got that predisposition, you're already susceptible, and then you couple that with, when you couple that with the immediate trigger, that's when someone's most likely to develop a mental disorder. So you've got one person's had a predisposition, family history of depression, and yet goes their whole life never suffering from that mental disorder. Someone else goes through several significant major stresses, but never develops the diagnosis of depression. But someone's more likely, if they've got that predisposition, the family history, say, and then also has those immediate triggers of the major stresses, that's when you get the 2 hits, which could explain why that individual does develop a mental disorder. But again, everyone's different, and there's no guarantees, there's no certainties in saying this person is predestined to have a mental disorder. It's just we're talking about statistically and more likely more susceptible. Okay, so those 2 come sort of before the onset of the mental disorder. Predisposing way back, precipitating more immediate. Perpetuating factors, these are things that keep the mental disorder in place. They prolong the occurrence of the mental disorder. They inhibit recovery. So these are things that perpetuate, keep it going. You might have heard the expression perpetuate a myth or something like that. That means keep it going, keeps the myth alive. Perpetuating factors here are things that keep the mental disorder in place and help and prevent it being removed. So perpetuating factors, I'm stumbling over my piece here, perpetuating factors could be predisposing or precipitating factors that are continuing, right? That they aren't being dealt with, they're unaddressed, and so they could then become perpetuating factors after the onset of the mental disorder. It could also be things like an unwillingness to seek help. Maybe there's social stigma around seeking treatment, and so the person doesn't seek treatment, and so therefore they're inhibited in their ability to recover because they're not putting that in place. So anything that will maintain the mental disorder can be considered a perpetuating factor. Now, these first 3 Ps, predisposing, precipitating, and perpetuating, these are all risk factors. They increase an individual's risk of developing a mental disorder. The last one, we've got some good news. Perpetuating, I should have added the word, maybe I'll say maintains. It makes it continue and last. The last one isn't a risk factor, it's a protective factor. In fact, it's called its name is protective. And this one goes backwards. This is one that I'll use the arrow to indicate it actually makes it more likely that we will not develop a mental disorder. So it helps to prevent the occurrence or reoccurrence of a mental disorder. It helps to get rid of the mental disorder if you've got it, or helps to stop you getting it in the first place. So this includes lots of things. It can be having a strong social support network, right? If you've got good people in your life, this can help to reduce the risk of developing a mental disorder. If you've got high self-esteem, if you've got high levels of resilience, if you've got access to resources, whether that's medical resources or informational resources or just cash that can sometimes solve problems, these are all protective factors. So anything that helps to reduce risk of developing, that's not how you spell reduce, anything that will help to reduce risk of developing or having a reoccurrence of a mental disorder is a protective factor, something that will protect you from it. So that's it, the 4 Ps. Let's have a look at some more examples and also link it to another concept, the BioPsychosocial Framework. The VCAA produced this table, very helpful of them. And this links, not only does it give us several examples of different things that could be considered the 4 Ps, it also links it to the BioPsychosocial Framework, which is another important model to understand when talking about mental health. So this table links the 4 Ps with the biopsychosocial model. Now, I won't go through this because you can read it for yourself, but let's just demonstrate. Let's go through the biological factors. So a predisposing factor that is biological could be genetic vulnerability, right? You're born with your genes, so that's predisposing, it's long-term, and it's biological because it's about your physical makeup. A biological factor that's a precipitating risk factor would be things like poor sleep. That's something that's happening right now. Last night, or for the last month, I've been sleeping really poorly. I'm not getting all the benefits of a good night's sleep. And so this is biological because that has a chemical and physical influence on me, but it's also precipitating because it's immediate and could contribute directly to the onset of a mental disorder. A biological perpetuating risk factor could be if I've got poor response to medication due to genetic factors. So it's again that genetic idea that there's something biological, physically innate in me that means that I don't respond well to medications. This medication doesn't work for me, it has some negative side effects. Then that could lead to the maintenance, the ongoing of a mental disorder. So it's perpetuating. And finally, a protective factor could be getting good sleep, which we mentioned sleep before, having good diet, good physical health. These are all biological, physical-based protective factors that can help reduce the risk of a mental disorder. So like I said, I won't go through all the examples there, but hopefully you can see how the biopsychosocial framework and the 4P factor model work perfectly hand in hand, and you can create links to the two. So I hope that gives you a bit of a better understanding of some of the factors that can contribute to the onset of a mental disorder or the continuance of a mental disorder, or help to reduce the risk. Bearing in mind, of course, that everyone is different, and the presence or absence of any of these, while they may influence a person's vulnerability or risk, does not mean a guaranteed course of mental disorders.